Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this exciting event. I love the buzz in the room. I had to go back to this back corner over here. These are some of our LEAPS students. They're our new undergraduates who just joined us in August, and they're like still standing. So, you know, it looks like they're loving the program, but I'm really thrilled to see so many people here and to hear so much energy and feel so much energy in the room. It's really wonderful to have you join us for this auspicious event. What is this auspicious event, you might ask? It is the launch of the Eileen Lappin Weiser Center for the Learning Sciences. And I want to give a big thank you to Leslie Herrenkohl and the entire steering committee that she put together for their efforts to guide the launch process. I also want to thank Heidi Bennett, Natalie Davis, Leslie, of course, and John Wargo, who planned and coordinated the event. So they're some of the members of the steering committee, and Leslie may say more about the other members of the steering committee. You know, when you do these opening remarks, you always have to make sure that you're not stepping on the next speaker's comments. I want to tell you a little bit about Eileen Lappin Weiser and why she was motivated to start this center. So as you can see, she is a University of Michigan graduate, but she graduated with a music degree from the School of Music, Theater, and Dance, not from our beloved Marsal Family School of Education. Now, I've told her she can always come back and get another degree with us. She's declined for the short term. I'm still working on her. But we can see in her own words that she cares deeply about transforming education and making sure that we can do the best for all children. This is someone I spend a lot of time with, and I can vouch for the fact that she cares deeply about ensuring that all children have opportunities to learn according to their needs. She's very supportive of project and place-based education. She's very supportive of making sure that specialized learning needs are met for children, and she really wants children to have joy in their learning. She wants them to feel like they matter and to develop that sense of agency so that they can contribute to our shared well-being. Now, she gave an almost $15 million gift, and she continues to give to support us. We love it. Carissa Rumsey, our director of development and alumni relations, we love it when Eileen calls up and says, I have a few extra $1,000 that I'd like to direct your way to support Marsal's efforts. She is also incredibly generous across the university. So I just want to tell you a few things that Eileen does or has done. She served for many years on Michigan's State Board of Education. She has served on the National Assessment Governing Board, the Presidential Scholars Commission, and I'll tell you, she read every one of those scholars' applications in detail. She actually chaired the commission. She serves on the Michigan Science Center Board and on the Education Commission of the states. So this is someone who really does care about education. So why did Eileen want to establish this center, and why did we want to establish the center? Well, first of all, we know that we have an obligation to transform education, to really disrupt the way things are done, and to engage people in thinking differently about opportunities to learn. That's absolutely critical to the work we do at Marsal. We also need to be able to evolve. Some of you may have heard of this thing called artificial intelligence. That's something that is going to be either a tool for great opportunity or a tool for great terrible things that might happen with technology. It has promise, right? AI has promise, and there are many pitfalls of AI. We need to be evolving to make it the best tool it can be to ensure that we own it, that children own it, and that they're not owned by it. So that's just one way that we need to evolve. There are so many other changes constantly occurring in education. And we also want to be leaders. You know, I talk a lot about that language of leaders and best, and how I don't see it as a brag. I see it as a charge. I see it as an obligation that we are responsible to lead, to do our best work for others. And that's what the Center for the Learning Sciences is going to allow us to do, to be leading experts in both teaching and learning. So now we have two centers here. One is Teaching Works. Deborah Ball is right here in the audience. And we have the Center for the Learning Sciences. So we're really thinking about the interaction between teaching and learning. So let me tell you a little bit about another dimension of our Center for the Learning Sciences. Our center allows us to establish endowed professorships in the learning sciences. We have two, and these are very important professorships. And our first professorship is named for our dearly beloved Anne-Marie Sullivan Palinsar. Anne-Marie is a professor emerita. She served here at the university for 32 years. She started at a very young age and only recently retired. She is an Arthur F. Thurnau Professor, and the Thurnau Professorship is the highest honor that the university gives to honor undergraduate teaching. So it's given only to people who've achieved tenure. So they're already stellar researchers like Anne-Marie, and then they're awarded this great honor of respect for their teaching of undergraduates. She also is the Anne L. Brown Distinguished University Professor. Some of you may know the name Anne Brown. She was really, wouldn't you say, Anne-Marie, one of the leaders in developing this thing called the learning sciences. And so I was thrilled when Anne-Marie suggested that she might name her professorship for Anne Brown. So we're really happy about that. She's an elected member of the National Academy of Education, an American Educational Research Association, AERA for our LEAP students, fellow, and she has been elected to the Reading Hall of Fame, which is very exciting. The Reading Hall of Fame. It's like, it's in Cooperstown. No, it's not really. Her scholarship has transformed the field of cognition, learning, and instruction by developing a preeminent program of research based on the belief that the purpose of education is to ensure that all children can learn and learn in the ways that make the most sense for them. Anne-Marie was a mentor to me, someone I couldn't believe I was working with when I came here 28 years ago. And I'm so thrilled that we were able to name this endowed professorship for you. Now, you may notice she's not the holder of the Anne-Marie Sullivan Palinsar Endowed Professorship, because frankly, that would be weird, right? So, in fact, we have the great honor of announcing our new Anne-Marie Sullivan Palinsar Professor, Endowed Professor in the Learning Sciences, Leslie Herrenkohl. Leslie is also the inaugural director of the Eileen Lappin Weiser Center for the Learning Sciences. So funny how that worked out. She's widely recognized as one of the leading learning sciences scholars in the world, and we're so proud to have her on our faculty. Leslie's a developmental psychologist and a learning scientist, and her work focuses on the cognitive and social dimensions of learning. She brings a holistic, critical, sociocultural approach to examining learning and teaching as well, the sort of consequences for teaching of what we know about how people learn. She also has helped to develop our LEAPS program. And so you have a bunch of fans in the back of the room, our new undergraduates. And we're just really thankful to Leslie for taking on the development and the launch of this new center. Leslie, in typical fashion, did not simply, take these resources and run away and hide in her office and build her own thing. She brought a community together, and I think she's going to tell you about that community in just a few minutes. So I want to just say a personal note about Leslie. She is a dear colleague, a dear friend. She's community-minded, she's caring, and she is a superstar. So Leslie, with that, I'd like to turn it over to you and tell us more about the Eileen Lappin Weiser Learning Sciences Center, Center for the Learning Sciences.
Oh, thank you so much, Elizabeth. I am so grateful to Eileen Lappin Weiser for her generous gift. It's an honor to serve as the inaugural director and to be the Anne Marie Sullivan Palanzar Endowed Chair of Learning Sciences, named in honor of my mentor, colleague, and friend. This is an exciting day and the launch of an exciting year for the Eileen Lappin Weiser Center for the Learning Sciences. Since being named director of the center in late November of 2023, I've been hard at work with some incredible colleagues who you can see on the screen to get to this point today to officially launch the center. Beginning in January 2024, a steering committee was formed, and they helped get us, as Elizabeth was saying, to this moment. Can I ask all the steering committee members to stand, please? Yay. Yeah. Thank you, steering committee. This group of faculty has created the guiding values, vision, and mission for the center, and I thank them for their dedication and support. I also want to extend a special thank you to Drs. Natalie Davis and John Wargo, to Heidi Bennett, our new program manager. I just want to say Heidi joined us at the beginning of September, and we're here at this moment as a result of a lot of her effort to be at this event. So thank you, Heidi. They've played really important roles in the planning and facilitation of the launch events that are taking place both today and tomorrow morning. And I'd also like to thank the Marsal IT and facilities teams and the staff from the Dean's office for their help. And a big thank you to Nathan Haynes Magyar. He is the person responsible for our logo design. So we have stickers at all the tables, so you can appreciate Nathan's work. So we're so excited about that. So let me tell you a little bit about the center's mission. The mission recognizes that human beings are learners. That's what we do, regardless of our race or gender, language, or socioeconomic status. From birth until our last breath, we are active meaning makers who learn from others and from the world around us across time and in many different places. Learning, in our view, is exciting and engaging and filled with wonder and curiosity, or at least it can be. Developing new ways of knowing, doing, and being is exhilarating to experience, to witness, and to facilitate. As educators, we can work to understand and encourage and design for learning, and join Audre Lorde, who argues that, and I quote, "The learning process is something you can incite, literally incite like a riot," unquote. Yet we acknowledge that the histories of injustice and inequitable systems have resulted in a failure to recognize all forms of human learning and ingenuity, and have limited people's opportunities to learn because of bias connected to race, gender, language, socioeconomic status, ability, and other social categories. But human beings all share that capacity for learning, but not everyone has the opportunities that can support their learning. Our values and vision seek to acknowledge and address these injustices as we collectively envision and enact new possibilities for what can be. So some examples of the work that we imagine taking place under the auspices of the center include community engaged research, co-design of practices, tools, and technologies with communities, schools, and families, and learning opportunities such as practice-based and research internships for Marsal students. We plan to host experiences to support public audiences to learn more about human learning and to critically engage with claims about the roles of emerging technologies in human learning. Finally, we recognize the interconnectedness of learning and thriving for human beings in the natural world, which is one of the reasons today we're trying to hold a zero waste event. So we're hoping that you can help us. There are posted signs and student ambassadors that can help all of us as we leave the room today. So we imagine the center as an incubator for new ideas and collaborations between scholars, practitioners, and community members, especially in areas without current funding opportunities or in cases where a proof of concept is needed to be successful in applying for external funding. These projects advance new scholarship, tools, and practices, and extend and expand how we conceptualize learning. Currently, we have 4 seed projects under development. Professor Liz Kolb is leading a project to create a tool that evaluates the learning potential of educational applications. Professor John Wargo is advancing a group to consider a summer after-school program and play test lab for learning technologies. Professor Barry Fishman, as director of the New Leaps program, is facilitating a collaborative approach and line of inquiry around the community-engaged equitable learning in higher education. And Professor Angie Calabrese-Barton is bringing together several currently funded projects on learning related to climate and environmental justice to explore center-supported collective impact across these projects. So we're excited about those. And we also have many really interesting and exciting events, beginning with this event today, planned for this year. We will explore the theme of curiosity and the role it plays in people's learning, related research and practice. We are looking forward to using the forum to welcome colleagues from across campus who I see, some of whom are in the audience today. So we're glad people from across campus are joining us already at this event. And we'll ask you to join us again at these other events where we bring people together so that we can learn from one another and strengthen center connections across the university. So on November 13th, we'll welcome Professors Kishana Gray from the University of Michigan School of Information and Matthew Solomon from the University of Michigan's Department of Film, Television, and Media to share their work with us. During the winter months, we're holding listening sessions and an open house for faculty, staff, students, and community members. And in February, there'll be another lunch and learn opportunity focused on curiosity. In spring, we'll complete our first year with 2 engaged learning events, including the Spark Festival of Learning, led by Dr. Natalie Davis, and the Learning Levers Competition, which is administered by CEDAR under the director, Nate Phipps. A speaker awaiting final confirmation, so I can't share exactly who that will be at this point, will bring our year to the close. So I ask you to scan the QR code to sign up for our email list and stay tuned for more information on all the events we have planned for this year. You can find us in Suite 1323 on the first floor of this building and online at the web address on the slide. We have stickers, as I said, on all the tables, so please take those, put them on notebooks, computers, share them with others who may be interested in the center's activities. We want to say we are open for engagement and truly looking forward to advancing collaborations that impact research, practice, and tool development to support human learning for many years to come. So I want to say that I'm thrilled on this most important day to have a preeminent scholar whose work has impacted the learning sciences joining us to celebrate the launch of the center. Dr. Lee will share her presentation entitled New Frontiers in the Learning Sciences, Implications for Research and Infrastructures to Support Research Preparation, followed by a question and answer period that Dr. Natalie Davis will moderate. We're going to ask to open the floor to students first during that period of time. So I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Carol Lee today to you. She is the Tarry Professor Emerita, but don't believe the Emerita part, in the School of Education and Social Policy and African American Studies at Northwestern University. I first met Dr. Lee in 1995 at the McDonald Foundation annual meeting. I was a new postdoctoral fellow working with Anne-Marie, but traveling alone to engage with a bunch of people whose work I had read extensively but did not know personally. I met many distinguished scholars at that meeting whose research has impacted my own, yet I remember only one person's talk from that day, and that is Dr. Lee's. Her scholarship was a revelation to me as a young researcher interested in the role of sociocultural tools and practices in human learning. Dr. Lee is a paragon in our field, and her work, influence, and many awards are impossible to fully capture. She is currently president of the National Academy of Education and has served as past president, chairs, fellows in many different organizations, including the American Educational Research Association, the National Conference on Research in Language and Literacy, the Research Assembly of the National Council of Teachers of English, the International Society of the Learning Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the Reading Hall of Fame. She has received numerous awards, including the McGraw Prize in Education, the Squire Award, the President's Pacesetters Award for the American Association of Blacks in Higher Education, the Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Association of Colleges of Teacher Education, and an honorary doctorate from the University of Pretoria in South Africa. In 2023, she was selected by President Biden to serve on the National Board for Education Sciences. She is the founder of 3 African-centered schools in Chicago, spanning a 50-year history. Her research addresses cultural supports for learning that includes a broad ecological focus with attention to language and literacy and African-American youth. In addition to her own stellar work, Dr. Lee has been a tremendous supporter of others, and that support is felt across the learning sciences, as her mentees are now in leadership roles in practice, research, and philanthropic spaces. Her career spans 58 years, including positions teaching high school, primary school, and community college before joining Northwestern University. So please join me with a warm Michigan welcome to the incredible Dr. Carol Lee.
So let me apologize first for reading my address, because I have a lot to say and I find it best to write it down. So I'm going to apologize because I'm going to read what I have to say. It's going to be interesting trying to see it, but anyway. So I will start by sharing my professional journey to where I am now at 79. I began my career trained as a high school English teacher and taught for 2 years at Inglewood High School in Chicago. I then went back for a master's in literature at the University of Chicago and then went on to teach in the city colleges of Chicago from 1969 to 1974. After meeting the poet and an architect of the Black Arts Movement, Don L. Lee, in 1969, I went on to work with others to found 2 African-centered institutions. One of the Institute of Positive Education, which you can see, this was an old picture, that focused on education, broadly speaking, sponsoring events to engage the African-American community of Chicago in interrogating the political and economic challenges we faced, and in supporting a deep engagement with the history and intergenerational cultural practices of communities of African descent in the Chicago and across the nation, and across the African diaspora and the African continent. So I should always add to that when I made that decision to quit my job at the city colleges, my mother thought I had lost my mind, and that this young man, Donnell Lee, she said he had put the hoodoo on me. We believed in holistic development and also acquired a farm and a sponsored food co-op. And that's a good part of my family, not all of them there. But then in 1972, we founded our first school, New Concept Development Center, as an African-centered early childhood program. By 1974, responding to the request of the families that we serve, we expanded New Concept into a full-time program. As I said then, this joke was supposed to come later. I then, much to my mother's dismay, quit my job at the city college and began to teach third graders in a storefront that we rented. And so that's one of those early classes. And I might add, and I'll see a picture of many of these kids later, most of these kids now are in their 40s as adults out in the world doing wonderful, wonderful things. And that's what I looked like when I was relatively young. At that point in my life, I had no children, had no formal training teaching young children from either a developmental perspective or in terms of the disciplinary content knowledge for young children. Among the values of that professional shift and life course shift, because by 1975, I would go on to marry this poet, Donnell Lee, was that we as teachers recognized we were embarking on a professional journey different from our training. We formed essentially a professional learning community and began to study together. We studied Piaget, what was going on in China and other places in the world around education, and indeed digging into the disciplines we were teaching, both to understand the conceptual standards, but also how we could integrate African and African American culture into both the content and pedagogy of that class. I taught third grade full-time at New Concept from 1974 to 1988, when I decided that there were so many questions I had about learning that I would seek to enter a Ph.D. program to provide me with formal opportunities and supports around what I had puzzled over. And the second picture there, just in terms of sort of expansiveness of what we were trying to do in this small storefront school, that is Wole Soyinka. Some of you may know him, a famous Nigerian author, who came to visit our school. So those little kids over there were having conversations with Wole Soyinka back in the 70s. By 1998, we decided to expand our essentially private pre-K through grade 6 African-centered school into a charter school in order to not have to charge tuition. So then we founded what would become the Betty Shabazz International Charter School as an African-centered elementary charter school that now has 2 campuses. And so New Concept that we started in 72 is, I think 49, I can't do the calculations, Hyman, you can do that for me, but it's old. And a New Concept, Betty Shabazz, the charter school, is now 26 years old. So again, through both of these institutions and the kind of work that I'm going to propose, that for me, it's not theory. We have real world examples of extraordinary human beings who have come through this work that we're doing. I serve as one of the founders, as chairman of the board of directors, and as chair of the education committee of the Betty Shabazz board, meaning that I'm deeply and directly connected to the on-the-ground teaching at the 2 schools. I have also been able to conduct several of my most recent research projects at both campuses. And so the part of the point I'm trying to make is twofold that I think is relevant to the center. One is that, again, when we started this school, most of us were not trained. Most of us were trained to work with older kids, not little kids. None of us were parents. We had decided that we were going to develop these particularly when we were in the early childhood program, and we wanted to develop this African-centered kind of playful puzzlement activities for little kids. And we prepared, and they came on Saturday, and we discovered that 3- and 4-year-olds didn't know how to handle scissors that we had planned for the activity, right? But we set the stage of saying that we had a goal of doing good that we didn't know how to do, so we had to study together to do it. I then entered the education program, a Ph.D. program at the University of Chicago, and worked under the tutelage of George Hillocks, among the major scholars in literacy education. I learned so much from working with George, and I know Anne-Marie knows George and his work well, but I, excuse me, I also was required to take a course that was taught by Tom Trabasso, a psychologist. In fact, the class was taught by Tom Trabasso and his wife, Nancy Stein, both psychologists who, among other topics, studied narrative sense-making. In that class, I had the opportunity to read the work of Jeff Sachs, specifically his research of mathematical reasoning among children living in poverty who sold candy on the streets. So Jeff Sachs, most of his work has been in math education. The study was of children living in poverty in an urban center in Brazil who sold candy on the streets, and the ways in which they had learned through the support of their social network, which included network of other children, they would buy candy wholesale, and then they would figure out how to group the candy and how to sell it, including selling it to foreigners who were dealing with foreign exchange. But these were same children who were sometimes not in school, or in school there was no connection to the fact that they were able to engage in this very sophisticated mathematical reasoning. They didn't have any little, calculators or computers. They were doing it all mentally. And it was that process of his work in math education, although I'm not a math educator, that sparked my thinking about how to think about connections between the kinds of sense-making that kids engage in everyday practices that are not connected to schooling, that are really important to understand. So I've told Jeff this story of my sitting in my van outside of Judd Hall, thinking about the relevance of Jeff's research around conceptual and epistemological relations among disciplinary reasoning, in this case around mathematical problem solving and in participation in routine cultural practices. So I want to add here, I thought that the audience was just going to be a bunch of faculty members, and I'm very appreciative that it's such a broad, diverse audience. So sometimes I'm going to use terms that I have to make sure I explain them. But this notion of not only conceptual relationships, but epistemological relationships, and I'll talk about this in a little more detail later on, is that what you think you're doing matters, right? And epistemology has to do with what do you think are the goals of the task that you're trying to engage in. And some of what happens in schooling often is that kids, especially by the time they get to middle school and high school, have learned that the game is the teacher has something in his or her head that they're going to tell you. When they ask you questions, they want you to tell them what's in their head. And very often it means that a lot of the sort of ingenuity and creative ways in which kids think don't get involved because they've been socialized into schooling and to think this is not about thinking. This is about figuring out what this teacher wants to hear. That's epistemology, which is a really important part of process of learning. I figure out where I was. In this case, around mathematical problem solving, I was also reading both Geneva Smitherson's research around genre of language play among speakers of African American English called signifying, as well as Henry Louis Gates' work on signifying as a metaphor for literary analysis. So for those of you who don't know, signifying is a form of ritual joking in the Black community. Your mama's so skinny she could do a hula hoop and a Cheerio. And those of us who speak African American English are fairly adept at this. So bottom line, I was able to conceptualize a program of research for my dissertation that sought to connect what I had learned from Jeff about mathematical reasoning situated in everyday cultural practices, and Geneva and Skip Gates' work around the importance of an intergenerational genre of language play signifying, with which I was, of course, very familiar. I should also add that when I started this work, and I hope this will all connect to some points that I'm going to be trying to make across this talk, is that on the one hand, I was certainly familiar with signifying because I'm a speaker of African American English, and at some point I'm going to make a point and I'm going to go revert to African American English because I think rhetorically it's very powerful. But also there were intergenerational development that I didn't know anything about. So that when I would try to find examples of signifying, I would end up talking to my own children who were teenagers at the time, who knew more about its uptake in things like hip hop and music than I knew, right? And part of the point that I'm trying to make, across this talk is the notion of the complexity of human learning and development and the multiple spaces and ways that it takes into account, some of which also involve, and I'm gonna have some bullet points that are much too dense, and I'll try to break them down a little bit, of where in the life course learners are matters for what they know, which may be different from what you know. You have these young people in the back, and there's a whole range of kinds of knowledge that they have access to that those of you who are older than them probably do not. Upon the completion of the dissertation, I applied for a position at the School of Education and Social Policy at Northwestern University because Diana Slaughter Defoe, the first African-American faculty member in the School of Education at Northwestern in its history, this was 1991, the first in the School of Education to have an appointment. She alerted me of the position, and because we still had these 3 independent African-centered schools and institutions in Chicago, and because my mother and brothers lived in Chicago, and by that time, my husband and I had 3 children, leaving Chicago was not on the table. So I entered the School of Education and Social Policy, which we call CESP, in 1991. I finished my Ph.D. in 3 years because they told me I had funding for 3 years, so I figured that that was the normative expectation. At the same time that the Learning Sciences program was starting at Northwestern. And at that time, the first and only Learning Sciences PhD program in the country. 2 external initiatives influenced the opportunities I had to learn how to fit into this program for which I had not been formally trained. So again, as I had discussed with some of your colleagues earlier, I'm trained as a high school English teacher. I've got a master's degree in literature. I've had 1 quarter course in cognition with Tom Trabasso and Nancy Stein. Never had a course in human development, never had any other courses, in psychology in any way. And I end up in this new program with a bunch of cognitive psychologists. And I figured that if I was going to survive, I had to figure out something of what they did, in order to manage it. So what the Learning Sciences program at that time, CESP, has a Learning Sciences program at the PhD and master's level, has a program in human development and social policy. But we live in our own little silos. We meet at faculty meetings and that's about it. But one was the Spencer Foundation gave CESP a grant to think creatively about our PhD program across the 3 areas of specialization: learning sciences, human development, and social policy. And one of the ways we sought to carry out this vision was to create a joint seminar between learning sciences and what we call HUDSEP, or Human Development and Social Policy. And I had the honor of co-teaching that seminar across 10 years with 3 different colleagues from HUDSEP. One, Gunhild Hagestad, who was a sociologist, Phil Bowman, who was on your faculty here, and Bart Hirsch, both in human development. And I understand that Phil is now retiring from the University of Michigan. He and I actually had dinner last night, where he went after he left Northwestern, actually went to the University of Illinois, Chicago, and then, came here. But because I was having to co-teach this class with people who were trained in fields that I wasn't, opened up a whole world for me in terms of the kinds of literature I read and the kinds of theories and methods that I thought about. And I've said, to the other group that if I had ended up in a traditional language and literacy program, which Anne-Marie is where I should have ended up, right, in my training, I would know that I would never have been able to give this talk. I would never be thinking about the issues that I'm now kind of wrestling with. So the seminar was essential in the evolution of my thinking as I was introduced to bodies of literature and human development that had never been on my radar screen professionally, except minimally in the course, taught by Tom Travasso and Nancy Stein. And one of the things that was also interesting in that, because part of what I'm going to try to pull together as I move through this talk is to try to make connections between the relations between the different phases of both my professional and personal life. So as you all know, Phil Bowman's work, and he's one of the major, psychologists in the country dealing around with issues of racial identity and racial, development. So I intuitively knew that literature because I'm socialized in my early 20s in the midst of the Black arts, Black Power movement. I've married, this man who's one of the architects of the Black arts movement. I founded these schools, which at that point had already been in existence for 10, 15 years. So the notion of the salience of a positive sense of racial identity, I already intuitively knew that, but I had no sense that there was a research literature. I had no access to any concepts or anything. And it was that mentoring essentially by my professional colleague, not my teacher, Philip Bowman, that really gave me tools analytically for thinking about that. Ironically, when I was developing my presidential address at AERA in 2010, my poet husband gave me a book by E.O. Wilson, which opened another world for me, thinking about biological processes that underlie what we do, how we do what we do, as humans. And I should add this sort of interesting aspect of, I'm trying to make the point across this talk about my meager attempts to be as cross-disciplinary and widespread in my thinking, the things that I read. My husband is addicted to books, literally. So we had one house and I convinced him for us to build another house from the ground up. And the only way I got him to agree was that he could have the whole basement. And he has probably 10,000 books. And he constantly, he has to go in the library and he has to, just to get around all those books. But he is the one who gave me this book, Consilience by E.O. Wilson. It's not a book of poetry, right? So the E.O. Wilson book would open up another world for me, thinking about biological processes underlying our activities as human beings. That then led me to begin reading in the areas of the neurosciences, and most specifically the work initially of Andy Meltzoff, and most recently Mary Helen Immordino-Yang. I should also say that foundational to my evolving thinking about human learning and development has been the work of Margaret Beale Spencer, specifically her framework, Phenomenological Variant of Ecological Systems of Theory. The phenomenological point is simply a body of research that says that human beings' perceptions matter. What they think, what you think is going on, whether it's in what you think about yourself, what you think about what's going on in the setting where you are, what you think about relationships that you're having with other humans being matter in very essential ways for learning and development. I've been able to co-publish one article also with Margaret Spencer in Educational Research back in 2003, and that little vision over there was an attempt for me to try to connect my own theorizing around what I called cultural modeling and her work. And I want to say one other thing about Margaret's work that I think is very essential for all the work that we're talking about doing, and that is her attention to sources of resilience in the face of challenge and trauma, and the ways in which her work in many respects challenges assumptions that we have. And again, I'm gonna try to deal with this a little more detail later, but I do believe that very much in the world of educational research and related fields, that people who face systemic challenges, racism, poverty, etc., are viewed as, what's the word I want? Objects of a deterministic system. And I was going to say, first I was going to say y'all, but I should say we think we know how to fix them. as opposed to saying, what does it mean to understand the resilience? If there was not systemic sets of values and relationships, for example, in the community of African descent people in the United States, I would still be enslaved. And I'm not enslaved because of the agency of my ancestors to fight those systems. And we don't pay enough attention to that. But Margaret's work is very much about that. And the other point that Margaret made, I always tell her she should be my point person, pay me as her like front man, front woman or whatever, is she says that to be human is to be vulnerable. And the example I always give with that is that the Kennedy family, and you look at, the reason I have gray hair is I'll be in the middle saying stuff and I can't remember what I was going to say. John Kennedy's mother, right? And the whole, the devil and Daniel Webster, that if the devil had come to her and said, I'm going to save your children and your grandson, you just have to give up your money, I believe she would have given up the money, because, she had two sons to be assassinated, and a third son who, was killed during World War II, and then her grandson died in that. I don't know that the daddy would have made that deal, but I believe that she would, and that what allowed her to move through that was not her money, it was her religion and her relationships with family. So I'm just saying the issue of all the social justice oriented work that you want to do, that we're all engaged in, I think is very important to understand the sources of resilience and not simply look at communities as somehow there's this system and it's so oppressive that, there's nothing to do but be limited by it. And then with Andy Meltzoff, most recently, in the Handbook on Cultural Foundations of Learning that I co-edited with Nyla Nazir, Roy P., Maxine McKinney de Royster. So I ended up co-writing an article with this neuroscientist who I set friends with. I never thought I'd be co-publishing with a neuroscientist. And I should add that this Handbook of Cultural Foundations of Learning, which will, across its depth, address some of the big ideas about human learning development that I'm going to eventually get to, is free. You can get it's in open access, so you can get this big old handbook, students, free of charge. And most recently have co-edited with Rich Lerner, from whom I learned much about complex dynamic systems, for which I was first introduced by my Northwestern colleague, Yuri Walensky, with David Osher and Vivian Gaston, focusing on the implications of an evolving science of learning and development for education in this new issue of Review of Research in Education. So again, that both the handbook is free, and if you're a member of AERA, you get access to the Review of Research free. And finally, I would reference the distinguished lecture I gave at AERA in 2022 titled, How the Sciences of Human Learning and Diversity Can Inform Foundational Truths About the Centrality and Complexity of Diversity, Wrestling with Interrogations of Race and Resilience Through a Grandma's Lens. In this address, yet to be published, I talk about my most recent journey, where I use my cell phone to capture moments of evidence of the complexity of development among my grandchildren. Haki, my husband, had 3 children before we were married, and together we have 3. This means we have 2 cohorts of grandchildren, 3 of whom are adults, one of whom sadly several years ago committed suicide and is no longer walking on top of the earth, but living forever in our hearts. And then another 5 who are young, 14, 10, 8, 7, and 6. And watching these young ones, I am now able to bring a technical lens to trying to understand the fascinating things that they do without adult supervision or adult initiating, and so have committed to capturing a historical record of my cell phone. And the point that I use of this is that, and when I get to these sort of technical explanation of this evolving science of learning and development, as it is evolving, is when I detail in the slides to come all the dimensions, the big ideas that are emerging in this science of learning and development, it can sound absolutely overwhelming It just sounds so daggone complicated, except we see it every day. And for me, the lens that I have, and part of what I'm trying to sort of wrestle with here is the sort of connection between my informal experiences learning as an adult, as a parent, and my technical training for having to have tools to understand the phenomena. And I can see all this complexity in those little babies and things that they do that adults do not organize for them, and adults do not ask them to do, and adults do not evaluate. But you taught me this, they come out of the womb ready, propelled to learn. And unfortunately, much of what we do is try to constrain them from what they are born and they have developed by their evolution as a human species to do. And I see it. As I said, I have like hundreds of on this cell phone as just this fascinating database. And part of two things for me is, as you as a center are trying to wrestle with the complexity of the kind of problems that you're addressing, and you're trying to wrestle with what are the tools that we have to try to deal with the complexity of the problem space. I'm saying it starts with trying to map out what are all the factors that are involved in whatever this activity is, and what tools do we have to wrestle with what parts of them. And we probably don't have tools to wrestle with the full complexity. But the extent to which you can capture through videotaping people involved in real world activity, to me, it begins to make it more accessible. And if we have time, toward the end on another presentation, I was telling Leslie, I had prepared this thing for one audience, and when I was like, how diverse, and maybe I should give you the AERA address because I have the videos of my grandbabies, but so maybe we'll get to it. But again, in every instance, it is this just fascinating complexity that I'm trying to wrestle with, and it makes sense to me from beyond a technical theoretical, because I can see it in real human activity. So why do I share this long personal history with you? For me, the takeaway have to do with the kinds of experiences, life experiences before the Ph.D. and professional learning opportunities, both during and after the Ph.D., that support wrestling with the complexities of an evolving science of learning and development, or more accurately, the sciences. So there's literature that has been published, and people are calling it the science of learning and development. But I call it the sciences with an S, because we're drawing from multiple disciplines, and there's been no authoritative synthesis across it. But what for me is powerful is these ideas that I'm going to show you with too many words, is that the ideas are coming up in these various fields who are not in conversation with one another, but the ideas are convergent, which means there's something powerful that's going on. And you are at a cutting edge point of trying to figure out how to draw from all these resources in an integrative way. So this is my takeaway, right? There you go, that. So developing epistemological and ontological dispositions to inquire beyond the disciplinary silos in which we are trained as undergraduates, master's students, or the Ph.D., in programs in which we're enrolled or in which we teach as faculty or postdocs, and as faculty across our professional careers. I'm still digging into new areas, the neurosciences, complex dynamic systems, phenomenological history, none of for which I have any formal training whatsoever. And this notion of ontological dispositions to me is very important, as much of what we think about in teaching in both formal and informal settings is knowledge. In the context of schooling, it tends to be knowledge in academic areas of study of literature, science, and mathematics. But in the field of practice, not only in the United States, but much of the Western world, there's an ontological disposition. Ontological having to do with how did this stuff get started? He said, all started in Europe. But it didn't. And so rethinking the disciplines in terms of what's the evolution of mathematical knowledge, you know? Why is it that when I was teaching in this third grade class, in the midst of the new math, Hyman, in the 70s, and I made the decision, there was no commercial curriculum or such for me to buy. We were teaching about bases. These were third graders. So I taught them the history of the base 10 system emerging out of the Arabic world. I taught them about the base 5 system, that is a Yoruba system among the Yoruba people of West Africa, and the base 2 system, and base 5 also, like with the abacus and the like in China. And my thinking was that I was teaching them conceptually a rich way of understanding bases, but also of understanding that there's a social foundation, that human beings create mathematical explanations of phenomena in the world in different contexts at different points in time with different explanatory power, and that influence, one another. Now I understand, I don't get it, I'm, Deborah and Hyman, I'm out of my bailiwick in here, but that the point that there was something that was happening in the Roman Empire where the system they had for currency with the forms of exchange that were following weren't working, and then they adopted, I think it was the base 10 or whatever. But the idea that the academic disciplines that we value from an ontological perspective, if we're really thinking about trying to prepare people for a complex world, the origins of that knowledge are not limited to one place or area in the world. Wrestling with the complexities of the human condition and seeking to connect theory we see as resources to what we can observe in the real world, and that embedding one's work in the ethical dimensions of research with and among humans, and indeed, if we take seriously indigenous knowledge systems, ethical dimensions of research that involve the natural world and our relationships with humans as animals and other forms of life in the natural world. So I'm sure you're familiar with indigenous knowledge systems, in which the argument is that there are a set of intergenerational practices of the ways in which various indigenous communities perceive the relationship between humans and other life forms, animals and plants, not as hierarchies where humans are at the top, but that there's an interdependence. And he'll talk about plant life as brothers, and sisters. And this is, again, another example of the sort of ontological and the ways in which we have powerful new opportunities to wrestle with the complexity of this phenomena that, as I say, I'm going to my Black English now, then Mama Nature has created an extraordinary complex system of which we are only a tiny part, right? And in that, she has created an order, I think, that we will never fully understand. I think one of the reasons that human communities all typically have conceptions about a God is because there's an intuitive understanding that there's phenomena about all that exists that we'll never fully understand. But that complexity of what she, intentionally I said she, has created, has an order that is not linear, that is dynamic and complex, right? And so things like climate change, that Mama Nature says, you don't have to believe me, you can keep polluting the air, y'all can die off, I don't care. I have viruses that are smarter than you all to begin with because they're better at adaptation than you are. But if you don't have the humility to try to wrestle with the complexity of what I've created, then you can go, right? One caution is that it's unlikely in our paths toward interdisciplinary navigations that we will ever become experts of all the relevant disciplines. This is where developing partnerships with others who bring different theoretical, disciplinary, and methodological areas of expertise is a useful enterprise, but one I can imagine and acknowledge that is difficult to navigate. I learned the ethical dimensions of this work, coming of age during the Black Power and Black Arts movement, and invoking the visions of these movements into my teaching, particularly in the African-centered schools that we founded. And additionally, in my role as a parent, committed to raising children who were steeped in African and African-American history and culture, were good people who valued commitment to both family and community, and who were intellectually curious. At 44, 47, and 49, I think Haki and I did a good job. And as we can see in their children, these wonderful grandchildren, that the lessons we sought to teach are being passed on to this next generation, but in ways more expansive than we had imagined as parents. And again, this is one of the important issues I keep trying to reference when I go on this most technical attempt to capture some of this breadth of this notion of a science of learning and development, the importance of time. So I can see in my children raising my grandchildren, I can see practices that we as parents used with them. But because of this moment in time in which they're raising children, that there are other dimensions of what they're trying to socialize and do that I don't know anything about, because the point in time when they are taking on these responsibilities is different. And the overall point of that is, in whatever it is phenomena we're trying to study or wrestle with, understanding the dimensions of time are going to be essential. What's going on in the broader cultural historical context of that moment? How old are you when you experience that? So something, like Glenda Elder's work on with the children of the Great Depression, that not only did the fact of the Depression fundamentally influence a lot of perceptions that people had, but also it mattered how old you were. Were you a young child at the point of the Depression versus you were an adolescent, where you had to make a different decision about having to go out and work rather than go to higher education or something like that. My mother was born in 1920, a child of the Great Depression, essentially, and she always had cash stashed away. They were in books, drawers, under the mattress. And I couldn't even imagine I would put that. When her father died, my grandfather, same thing. He had money stashed away. Why? Because they came of age in the midst of the Great Depression. And in our schools, teachers are called Mama and Baba, Swahili for father, to symbolize that as teachers, we are not mere technicians imparting knowledge, but rather stand in local parentis to work with families to develop whole human beings, intellectually curious, committed to doing good in the world, and empathetic to others. And so the pictures that I showed you of the older children who are all, I said they're all literally in their 40s at this point. In our schools, I have an African name, Safisha Matabuti, and I can see these, every Kwanzaa, people know Kwanzaa Christmas, these kids who would come through our school in their 30s and 40s, some cases 50s, quite frankly. They, have a gathering, we meet them again, and they will still call me Mama. And sometimes we've had in the history of the school when we bring new teachers and everything, I'm Mrs. So-and-so and Miss So-and-so. I said, if this child is willing to call you the same name that they do their mama, you better take that as an honor. And what it implies is that there's an ethical, long-term dimension of the relationship that we're establishing with our children. So learning sciences as a field has evolved since 1991. In fact, its origins preceded the 1991 Learning Sciences program at Northwestern, most specifically in the work of Roger Schenck, who established his own institute, the Institute for the Learning Sciences, that preceded the School of Education in 1991. Anne Brown, I think you had mentioned, one of the early leaders in learning sciences, talked about learning sciences as a field that sought to study basic theories of human learning and development in real-world contexts. In contrast to the traditions in psychology at that point was that you studied learning in experimental designs and labs. With that idea, she sought to distinguish learning sciences from traditional foci across psychology, most specifically cognitive psychology, whose traditions or to conduct experimental designs in laboratory settings, but even that being challenged, for example, by Urie Bronfenbrenner's 1979 challenges around what he called ecological validity. That is, you're doing a design that bears no relationship to people's experiences in the world, and you think you can extrapolate from that. And by the evolving body of research from the 1970s forward among researchers who in many cases sought to question Piaget and other assumptions about universal pathways and stages of development, the work of Michael Cole, Barbara Rogoff, Pat Greenfield, Jeff Sachs, Jean Laves, Sylvia Scribner, Robert Sopel, Urie Bronfenbrenner, among others. And much of this work, of course, influenced by the translations of the work of Lev Vygotsky into English by Michael Cole and others. This body of research centralized attention to the importance of trying to understand differential pathways of development by virtue of people's participation in routine cultural practices. And if you look at the learning sciences as a field, certainly captured in the scope of work captured in conferences and publications of the International Society for the Learning Sciences, attention to culture and practices in real-world settings and privileging goals around equity and social justice are very much ingrained and privileged in the field of the learning sciences. And I'm going to repeat this again at some other later slide, but part of what has evolved, and part of what I was saying to meeting with the center leadership team, is that while on the one hand you're saying you want to have a center for the learning sciences, and what I'm suggesting is that there's an emerging field that people are calling the science or science of human learning development that is broader than learning sciences. And some of the complexities that I'm going to try to point out as I move through this are not routine in any way in the field of the learning sciences. And that long body of work from the 70s forward, focusing on people's participation in cultural practices and the divergent pathways through which humans learn and development, has kind of been siloed off. So if you want to do sociocultural theory, you know what I mean, then you'll be progressive and you can go out and look at all that stuff, but it ain't central, right? But the emerging work, particularly in the neurosciences that I, again, will briefly talk about if I get through this stuff a little faster, is that our bodies, brains, and genes follow experience in the world. And that's just how humans have evolved as a species, which means that attention to participation in cultural practices and belief systems and emotions are essential to human learning development. It's not some little special thing that you pay attention to because you want to do, you want to help these other people. So the science of learning. So what I want to introduce is evolving research in what is being called the science of learning and development, or SOUL. I prefer to call this the sciences with an S of learning and development because there's not yet been a formal synthesis. The big ideas that I will share are ones that have been validated in empirical research, not just theorizing, across multiple fields: human development, various fields of psychology, cognitive, social, cultural, the neurosciences, cognitive and affective, and indeed learning sciences, as well as complementary findings in anthropology. And while we have validation of different ones of these broad ideas within disciplines, and while there are publications that seek to synthesize across these findings, there has not yet been a formal synthesis such as we would expect, for example, from the National Academy of Science. The most recent How People Learn made some efforts to highlight, for example, the importance of attention to participation in routine cultural practices, and for which I understand there was substantive debate among members of that team. It did not rise to the breadth of complexity of the most recent findings. And so, those of you familiar with the How People Learn too, their opening chapter, there's attention to culture, and after that, it's gone because they couldn't really come to synthesis. So the big ideas, it's a lot of writing, right? So, one, then learning and development, the processes through which the human holistically develops physically, cognitively, emotionally, socially, and phenomenologically over the life course unfold within dynamic systems. that such dynamic systems include the individual, the array of settings in which the individual routinely participates, the social networks and relationships that are central to how these settings work and that structure individual and group behavior and meaning making, the routine cultural practices in such settings, the dynamic, mutually co-acting relationships among those settings, the historically created structural factors that constrain and incentivize how people act and organize themselves. And one of the key features of all of these dimensions is the notion of dynamism, right? That we have had a tradition in our studies of learning, particularly from a cognitive perspective, that learning unfolds in some linear process, and that there are causal factors that you can predict in some linear kind of way. So if we do this, then these things are going to change. And the notion of dynamic systems is this notion of what they call, in part, emergence, that things happen in ways that are not predicted by this, and this, but by interactions that unfold in very different kinds of ways. And part of what, for me, again, is so fascinating are the warrants in the neurosciences. And I would encourage you all to look up Mary Helen Emmerdine, yeah, other people, but Mary and I are buddies now. I'm off on a thing with her. But she has a great, on YouTube, it's about a 5-minute little video. I think it's called I don't think it's a TED Talk, it's an AERA talk, but it's about 5 minutes in which she makes so clear the ways in which thinking and perceptions and feelings in this brain up here are going do all together. And it's not any kind of one. And wrestling with, when we were working on this review of research and education, particularly with Rich Lerner, who's done a lot of work around complex systems, we kept wrestling with how do we find the right verb to talk about the relationships? Because every verb we would come up was a verb about a linear cause of something, when that's not how stuff unfolds, right? There are different senses of time that contribute to these dynamic systems. Microgenetic time, the moment-by-moment experiences and resulting fluctuations of individuals as they participate in routine settings. So how you experience whatever's going on in the moment. Some of you who are sitting here totally bored, why the hell am I here? And others of you, your mind is, going in all kind of different directions. How you experience what is going on here in this moment of time are going to matter. Ontogenetic time, which I talked about. So when in the life course, the individual is experiencing participation in such settings. My grandbaby thing is this digital world they live in. They have these little tablets to which they are absolutely, addicted. And on the one hand, I'm listening to people saying if they spend, too much time on screen, it's going to be a bad thing. And then I watch these little games that they're playing and they're trying to figure out, how to get this one and that one does something and all is complex. I have no idea what the hell they're doing or thinking. And they're like 6, 7, 8, 10 years old, right? And it's because of the ontogenetic it is a combination actually of the cultural historical time, but ontogenetic in the sense that that age that they're in, 6, 7, 8, and 10, is one of intense exploration, right? Generational, cultural, and historical time, so the work of Glenn Elder, for example, the macro systems and the prevalent belief systems within specific moments in historical time. Great Depression, COVID pandemic, that continue to play out in people's lives and in their personal meaning making, the way in which the history of racist public policy and private behaviors situate current discipline disparity in schools and classrooms at community, district, school, classroom, teacher, etc. levels. And part of this notion, I think, of generational time also involves attention to cross-generational time. So, and I don't know if I'm gonna have time to get to this point, that, and I'll get to it in a point when I start talking about race, but enslaved Africans in New York, what would become Wall Street, 1700s, buried their dead in, again, what would eventually become Wall Street. And the Schomburg Center for Black Culture in the 1990s worked to get it recognized as a historic space. They built this wonderful monument, celebrating this. But they worked with archaeologists from Howard University to dig up remains. There was clear evidence of people of ill health. That was to be expected. What they were shocked to find was that people had been buried with positions, amulets, and markings on the body that said, I'm Yoruba, I'm Igbo, I'm not a slave. Y'all might think that, but I don't, right? And that there's sets of belief systems and systems of human relationships that allow people under those horrendous circumstances to survive, get up every day and put one foot in front of the next. And that those generational belief systems were in fact intergenerational. That is, they had come from their parents and grandparents. In that case, it would have been from wherever, continent largely of West Africa that they had come. Such as the notion that generational and intergenerational belief systems are important to pay attention to, because they very much structure a lot of how people see themselves and resources they have for being resilient. Relationships within the person's psychological processes and participation in routine cultural practices within and across settings also matter. That these psychological processes include perceptions of the self, along multiple dimensions: identity as an individual, as a member of multiple social groups or configurations of a nuclear family, extended family, social groups affiliated with ethnicity, including pan-ethnicities, race, gender, sexual orientation, conceptions of ability, age groupings, religion, nationality, political persuasion, special interest communities and groups such as hip hop, community, video games, sports teams, etc. And so it's not only the understanding that perceptions matter, but that perceptions are not silos. So when we think they have a tendency, we think about identity, and you have these little check-off things that you're male or you're female. Well, hey, you may not just be male or female, that you are quote unquote Black. And I'm not quite always clear what that means. I call her my co-granny of my youngest son's wife's mother, or their family are Black Panamanians. So are they Latino, they Black, what are they, That we have these siloed conceptions about perceptions that people have and the kinds of identity and affiliations they have. Their perceptions of the self with regard to self-efficacy, epistemology, and one's place in time matter, emotional salience that we attribute to experience, perceptions regarding social relationships and sense of obligations to such relationships, that these relations are also embodied, that is, they are holistically integrated and involve dynamic relationships among biological processes, physiological and behavioral processes, and participation in routine cultural practices. That our evolution as a human species enables each individual to self-construct a person-specific developmental system that involves building mutually beneficial social relationships with others. We don't seek to have relationships with people that we think want to hurt us, seeking safety and meaning and striving to feel efficacious, to matter, and to find purpose. That each person then has agency. Every individual can follow and learn from experience in the world rather than being a genetically deterministic machine-like entity. And that our brains operate in coordination with the physiological processes of our bodies in detecting experiences that we perceive as safe, as relevant, and rewarding, and typically resist indicators that we have evolved as individuals and members of groups that we perceive to be threatening. So the part of the overarching point that I'm really trying to make here is the importance, as we're thinking about the science of human learning and development, that biology and physiological processes are an essential part of that. And that can become problematic because this whole history of eugenics and the way in which the study of human biological processes have been used to demonize groups of human beings as pseudoscience, right? but that biology matters because we live in a human body. We experience the world through this human body. And the fascinating thing about what Mama Nature has done is to be able to develop these little neurons that are talking about all of this and all of you, and it's all going on, in these complex kind of intersections, and the ways in which we scientifically try to say, well, if you just deal with this region of bird, it works, or you don't have to, culture is some little extra thing that the lefties want to attend to, but it ain't science for real. There is, and I think I may have it a little bit later on in here, and I think I don't know, maybe because I know I'm about out of time, is again, just this importance of to be able to say essentially that to ignore the physiology of our bodies and to ignore how the physiology of our bodies has sustained us as a species so that we're not extinct. If you don't pay attention to that, you are going down a very poor path because it exists. So all of these dimensions represent a very complex conceptualization space, one that can be very challenging to imagine in both the real world and in imagining how to study such complexity. This is why I am now on this journey to watch my little grandchildren to play, because these big ideas are so evident when I watch them. And this is why Anne Brown's idea about studying basic theories of human learning and development in the real world settings is really important. I think that these propositions stand in tension with an array of propositions that we have sometime assumed to be normative in fields like psychology, human development, and learning sciences. And these include the idea that identity is singular, that cultural membership is singular, that cultural communities are solely homogenous, so that if you know that a person is African American, there's a file, you can pull out that file and you know everything you need to know about them. Our constructions of group membership, most specifically around the concept of race and indeed gender, are they're not only siloed, but there's a sense in which the concept of race doesn't exist. It was created to support the ideology of white supremacy. It's relatively recent in human history. The only explanatory power it has is around politics, but not around human development, and certainly conceptions around gender have become much more nuanced today. The notion of cognition as a singular construct, the idea of causality as linear, attention to single sites of activity, insufficient attention to resilience in the face of challenge, and Eurocentric ontologies regarding the academic disciplines that we teach in school. So, the big ideas, again, the salience of time that I've talked about, how emotions are activated in activity, how dynamic relations unfold in participation, thinking about emergence as a phenomena, how activity unfolds through dynamic relations among different levels of systems, interactions within the moment, within short and longer stretches of time, how resources within and across ecological systems constrain opportunities. So I think what I'm going to do now, just because I know we're over time, is rather than read, I'm going to just follow my slides here. Part of what I wanted to sort of acknowledge is my own personal history with this university and the way in which I've learned across that. So one of them was I learned from Deborah and Maggie Lampert in starting the Ph.D. because I had been teaching for 20 years before that I could actually study my own practice, right? I had no models. I knew of no other models for that other than Maggie and Deborah's work. It was 1993, Maggie and Deborah had a conference here where they had developed this massive set of videos of their practice as a database that you could, rely, which I was very fundamental in thinking about my own work. We were able to collect some videos from this. This one is a picture slide from one of Maggie Lampert's teaching her, 5th grade math class. I don't know if everybody knows about Maggie and Deborah's work, where this profound model of distinguished university professors who are doing research by teaching themselves in a second grade and fifth grade class, public school. And I think that this whole notion of how do we begin to wrestle with understanding the complexity of learning and development is in part studying what we're trying to do as opposed to studying other people. I'm not saying studying other people is not a good thing, but you can learn a heck of a lot more by being engaged. And in one of these little scenes, it might have been that particular one, about thinking about the complexity of dimensions of knowledge that we wanted to teach, was Maggie and Deborah had this, the pedagogy to give a complex problem, no commercial curriculum that they created, right? And the kids would have to keep a journal and solve their problem by themselves. They would have to explain why they solved it the way they did and why the answer made sense. And then they would meet in small groups to talk about it. And there was this one little instance in this video, this little kid, I think his name was Andrew, and he knew everything and he's doing all the talking. And Maggie goes up and whispers in his ear, mathematicians are trying to convince other people of what they're thinking. And if all you're doing is dominating this discussion, you're not going to get people to listen to you. And what she was teaching then was not simply the conceptual basis of the problem solving, but the ethical dimensions that you had to have empathy, with other people, the epistemological orientation, that it wasn't just about solving a problem, but doing something, with the knowledge that you have. So I've suggested here, and I think that I'm not going to try to read all of that, but just some suggestions that I've had, and I can share the paper with you all to use as you will, about specific kinds of activities I think that will be important in pulling this center off the ground. And part of that involves the notion that, again, if there's any takeaway, hopefully from what I've been trying to share, is that learning sciences as it exists as a field is not sufficient to do what you want to do. And that this evolving science of learning and development is much broader than learn sciences as a field. And therefore, as faculty, you need to be engaged in a process of ongoing study of these new things that are emerging, right? And being able to create forums, particularly where helping other people, even people in the community, policymakers, have with these community things you're talking about, with like sort of my grandma videos or there's a film that I use the clip from called Babies. Any of you see me talking, I'm always putting, you can pull it off the web. It's just a 2-minute little snippet. But this French filmmaker made this film studying the first year of life of babies from 3 or 4 different parts of the world, Namibia, I forget the place in Asia, San Francisco, whatever. And what he captures are these babies who are wrestling with the fundamental task of the first year of life, but in very different ways, for different social purposes, with different cultural supports. And for me, it's an example, like the videos of my babies, grandbabies, of being able to see the complexity in the real world. Because if you can't see it in the real world, it just sounds some esoteric, complex kind of thing that nobody could ever get their handle on. So final little slides here, again, because I think I had said earlier that I think the importance, particularly the social justice work that you're interested in, of understanding resilience, and that resilience often has to do with intergenerational beliefs and practices. So, and the process of trying to do this kind of work in the United States being very difficult, because in our system of education is decentralized rather than centralized. So you got to convince the work at the individual school, at the district, at the state, at the federal level, and the like. And part of what, of this whole contestation is now around what you can teach, particularly around our history, but our own involvement, in terms of the enslavement of Africans, the genocides in terms of the indigenous populations are here. And if you send, like Ken Burns, a recent documentary on the United States and the Holocaust, And on the one hand, these powerful stories of U.S. forces, liberating people at Auschwitz and the like, but how long it took us to get into that war. The fact that there was a whole, I'm sure the story, the whole was a ship of Jews had come from, I believe it was France somewhere, to try to get into the United States, and the United States says, no, you can't come. So all this complex history is one as our ability to understand resilience of people who experience this, but also the complex process of policy making and decision around dealing with these issues. That these are a long history, so all the stuff you guys are hearing right now about the immigrants and how they're coming to eat you and kill you and all of that. This is nothing new, unfortunately, in the United States. This notion I keep saying about the constructs to wrestle with around the construct of race and the ways in which we're using the language that we use. So we talk about people of color, like they're people who don't have color. You know what I mean? This is white, there are no white human beings. This is black, there's no black human beings. All human beings have some gradation of color, but the term people of color implicitly applies in us and in them. We talk, as you commonly use the notion of dominant culture, and the use of it reinforces the idea that there's a dominant culture, when in fact they're not. It's a hybrid culture, standard English, etc. This image came from a National Geographic, and it turns out these are twins. Right? And one looks quote unquote white and one of course looks black. And so who's supposed to be what? The conundrums of these racial categories that don't take into account the variety of ways in which there is such heterogeneity within communities that we don't take into account. And the fact that evolutionary, all y'all Africans, because that's where humans began, right? As I said, this issue of how we deal with this, the science in terms of biology and physiology is complicated by the whole history of scientific racism. This example in terms of this basic idea of human adaptability and diverse pathways of development. So this young man in here was born sighted. By the time I think he was 3 years old, he lost his sight. And this child, created an adaptive response to his losing his sight, in part by this evolutionary gift that Mama Nature gave us, that if you lose sight, your hearing and touch are enhanced. And so he developed this practice of, he would have a stick and he'd go around like whales do, and he could hear the reverberation to figure out things were in front of him. But he did it on his own. These are just images from Barbara Rogoff's book, her work. So here's this Iwe baby with a machete, right? Or this Mayan girl, 6 years old, taking care of a baby. And if you saw any of this in the United States, you would call the Department of Children and Family Services, right? Because we assume these sort of limited pathways in which human beings can develop. The sort of evolution of my own work, which again, I'm not going to deal with any detail, just that I started this work thinking about cognition and culture and disciplinary learning. And then I moved into thinking about issues of the reading of literature as an opportunity for identity development. So how I would think about text selection and stuff sort of changed. And then finally in the phase where I am now, where I've been collecting in that design work about kids' perceptions of themselves around racial identity, of the environment in which they will. So I'm just saying, over these 30 years of this phase of my life, all the stuff I've talked about, I keep sort of wrestling with how do I integrate it in the design. So closing out this report that we did with the National Academy, you can download it, Educating Pacific Reasoning and Discourse, simply suggesting that the kind of work that I'm talking about, that the fact that it not only has an ethical dimension, but it also has a special role to play in this unique democracy that was structured by the founding fathers, not the founding mothers, to accommodate difference, to have structures where trying to balance between the federal government, state government, between majority and minority rule, and giving the structures through which we can navigate through our differences, and arguing that there's a special role that public education is to prepare young people to engage in both the challenges and the opportunities. This is challenging right now, obviously, with the teaching the critical race theory. They just beat you all up, I understand, in the New York Times, right? That how dealing with this is how to reconcile this through our system of governance. People need to learn that in public education. I keep wrestling with the fact that I'm not going to sit here and say I'm taking a political position, although that is what I'm doing. But how we have a public, the majority of whom have gone through public K through 12 education, who can listen to some of the kinds of statements that are being made by some politicians, irrespective of what you think about the economy and federal government rule and all that sort of thing, and listen to that stuff. How do you get through 12 years of education? It's all very, very emotional. There is a report that has just come out on the impacts of this kind of push against any kind of teaching around anything having to do with diversity that Hiroyoshi Kamikawa and Mika Pollack have put out. It's available online. There's also, interestingly enough, there's a report that's making the argument that the National Science Foundation is funding pseudo research to support Marxist ends. It's put out by Ted Cruz. I thought it was an official publication of this congressional committee, but someone here we were with, I think it was Angie, right, that actually Ted Cruz put it out, but the cover suggests that it's from the congressional committee, which is not. So closing, last slide, obviously, I apologize for going so long, is that if we think about both of the complexity of what we're talking about, the foundational ways in which the relationships among human beings are essential to whatever it is we're trying to accomplish, and again, this goes back to the science of human learning and our evolution as a species, that when the babies come out of the mother's womb, they don't come out hating. They don't come out being empathetic. They can get mad, fight with each other, but that doesn't diminish their relationships in any way. So you all, I'm sure, know about this letter that this 6-year-old boy had written to President Obama in the midst of the Syrian war. He sees all of what's going on in the TV, and he asked President Obama to let this little boy that he saw on the television know that they could come, I start crying when I listen, could come and live with him and they would take care of him. The potential, the inquiry, of the children is not just that, but it's also their emotional openness to relationships. So you see the point.
Just in the interest of time, I think we're going to all close out and thank Professor Lee once again for this opportunity to co-think together. And if I may, Leslie, I'm not sure if you have remarks to close out, but I also, on behalf of the center, want to thank all of you for spending this evening with us and helping us to launch what we see as very exciting work within the School of Education. So thank you and good night.